The wind was a gentle murmur that morning, less a breeze and more a whispering hush threading through the cloisters of St. Ethelred's Abbey. Perched on a hillside blanketed by ancient yews and fog as thick as unshorn wool, the abbey had stood in solemn grace for more than 2 centuries, watching the centuries pass in silence. Brother Anselm stirred before the bell. He always did. The stone cell where he lay was a narrow chamber with walls that wore the cold like a habit. A small window, no more than a slit in the stone, framed a square of mist that hovered motionless outside, unbroken even by the early caws of crows. It was the kind of morning where the world seemed to hesitate, holding its breath. Anselm rose, carefully folding his woolen blanket and tucking the corners with practiced grace. His fingers, though gnarled by age and the ink of many manuscripts, moved with reverence through the morning rites. He washed with cold water from a chipped clay basin, the touch of it biting enough to stir alertness in his bones. Then he knelt, whispering prayers older than the stones under his knees. The abbey's bell had not rung in weeks. It was not broken, not in the ordinary sense. Brother Matthew, the abbey's smith and occasional bell-keeper, had climbed the tower to inspect it, declaring the rope intact and the bell sound. And yet, every morning when the sexton pulled, silence answered. Only the wind moaned softly, as if shushing some unseen cry. Anselm did not fear the silence. In truth, he welcomed it. For over 40 years he had lived within the abbey's stone embrace, copying scripture and histories, binding pages and repairing spines like a physician to the thoughts of centuries. Silence was a balm to his mind, a gentle fog through which his memories walked more clearly. Still he noticed things. That morning he noticed a pattern of frost on the wooden sill, a spiral not unlike the seal used by abbey scribes when cataloguing forbidden texts. Curious, he traced it with his finger. The cold felt deeper there, as though something ancient stirred beneath the touch. Later in the scriptorium, as shafts of pale light finally pierced the mist and warmed the long table lined with quills and inkpots, Anselm allowed his thoughts to linger on the frost spiral. He had seen that symbol only once before. In the restricted vault beneath the east transept, a place few monks entered more than once in their lives, there lay a manuscript older than the abbey itself, written in a script no one had been able to fully decipher. The seal on its binding matched the spiral on his window. He had not thought of it in years. As he transcribed a passage from the Rule of St. Benedict, his quill scratching rhythmically against vellum, the memory tugged at him like a child's. Had that night, long after Compline, when the other monks had retreated to their cells, and the halls breathed with the gentle snores of sleep, Anselm lit a single taper. Cloaking himself against the chill, he descended the worn steps to the undercroft. The air changed as he passed the threshold, denser, as if saturated with the breath of centuries. The vault door creaked open after some resistance, revealing rows of tomes, each bound in leather as dark as old wine. There it was, just where it had always been, a manuscript bound in seals of silver and a lock of wrought iron, its cover etched with the spiral now frosted on his window-pane. And there, though no draught stirred and no monk stirred above, the bell rang once, clear and slow, as though awakening from a long sleep. The flickering taper threw shifting shadows against the vault's curved ceiling. Brother Anselm stepped forward, each footfall echoing against flagstones older than memory. He held the light close, the flame casting a trembling halo on the locked manuscript silver bindings. The book sat heavy and still, its presence palpable, as though it breathed a little of the cold air around it. Its cover bore more than just the spiral. There were tiny etchings within the curve, intricate as a spider's web, each spoke ending in a symbol unfamiliar even to Anselm's seasoned eyes. He hesitated, fingers hovering. There had been a time, in his younger years, when curiosity burned brightly in him. Back then he might have opened it without pause. Now age had tempered that fire into an ember, steady, slow-burning, thoughtful. Still, the call of forgotten knowledge had not left him. He reached for the key. The Abbey's archivist, Brother Edric, had once shown him where it was kept, a small niche behind a loose stone in the apse. The key was wrought iron, twisted like a root, with 3 teeth and a handle shaped like a monk's hood. He fetched it quietly, the memory guiding his steps in the dark. When he returned to the manuscript, the vault felt colder. He inserted the key. The lock resisted at first, then clicked open with a sound like a sigh. The air stirred slightly, though there was no window, no breeze, and the candle fluttered. Anselm opened the cover. The first page was blank. He turned it, gently. The vellum was thick, the edges browned with time. The second page revealed an illumination, a tree vast and knotted, its branches curling like smoke. Beneath its roots, strange creatures slumbered, neither man nor beast, but something in between. Their faces were elongated, their eyes hollow. Above, the tree, a sun and a moon sat side by side. There were words too, but not in any tongue Anselm knew. Not Latin, Greek, or the clipped forms of Old Saxon. The script flowed like water, sinuous and looping, as though written not by hand, but by the drifting of wind over sand. He leaned closer, the scent of ancient leather and dust thick in his nostrils. Then softly something shifted. It was not a sound exactly, but a feeling, like the weight of the air around him had subtly changed. The candle's flame bent sideways, then steadied. From the edge of his vision, something seemed to move in the shadowed corners of the vault. He turned. Nothing. But the silence now was deeper, not just the absence of noise, but a fullness of stillness, like the hush before snowfall. Anselm returned to the book. The third page bore no picture, but instead a diagram, a series of concentric circles, intersected by lines that met at strange angles. Tiny figures, human in shape, but distorted in pose, stood at these crossings. He felt a tremor then, not from fear, but from recognition. Somewhere, long ago, he had seen this symbol. In a dream, perhaps, or in a memory so old it wore the mask of sleep. He turned another page. Here was a map, not of any known world, but of a place imagined. Rivers that flowed upward, mountains that floated, cities shaped like stars. The margins, teemed with notes, none of them in Latin, but all written in the same flowing hand. Then the candle flickered violently, the flame stretching tall and thin. The bell tolled again. One low, sonorous note, not from the tower, but from within the vault. Itself, Anselm's heart thudded. He stood slowly, his eyes scanning the shadowed corners. The sound had come from behind the rows of shelves, not a peal, but a single, resonant hum, like a breath held too long and finally released. And yet, nothing stirred. The manuscript now felt warmer in his hands, as though something within it had awakened with the chime. He closed it gently and replaced the silver clasp. The room seemed to exhale and the air lightened. As he left the vault, taper in hand, Anselm paused on the stairs and looked back. The candle cast his long shadow onto the stone, and for a brief flickering moment it looked as though his shadow turned and walked the other way. The rain began just after prime. It fell not in heavy torrents, but in a quiet, insistent drizzle, the kind that seeps into wool and stone alike, that smudges the horizon and draws the world close in a cocoon of grey. Brother Anselm stood beneath, the eaves outside the scriptorium, watching droplets gather on the edge of the roof before falling with soft, repetitive plinks into the barrel below. The air was scented with wet leaves, old wood, and something fainter, the faint metallic, scent of earth turned by water, The abbey grounds were quiet, the kind of quiet that invited long thoughts and longer silences. It was then he saw the figure. A man, cloaked in a heavy brown mantle, stood just beyond the outer gate. His posture was still, almost statuesque, and, though the rain soaked his garments, he made no move to shelter. Anselm watched him for several moments before curiosity overcame hesitation. He made his way slowly to the gate, feet squelching softly on the damp path. When he reached it, the man lifted his head. His face was unremarkable in its plainness, neither young nor old, his features smoothed by wind and weather. His eyes, however, held a stillness that unnerved even Anselm. They were the color of whetstone, grey and clear, and they regarded the monk with an unreadable calm. "Peace be upon you," Anselm offered, his voice quiet as the rain. "And upon this place," the man replied, his accent strange, not foreign, but of a cadence not heard in these parts for many years. "You are seeking shelter?" The man shook his head gently. "Only a moment's audience, if the abbey grants it." Anselm nodded and opened the gate. The man stepped through, not hurrying, his steps deliberate. They walked together in silence to the covered cloister, where the rain tapped lightly on the wooden beams above. Anselm gestured to a stone bench, and they sat. From beneath his cloak, the man withdrew a small parchment, folded many times and bound with a thin red thread. He handed it to Anselm without a word. The monk unfolded it slowly. There, drawn in delicate ink, was the same spiral he had seen on his windowsill and again in the manuscript. But this one was surrounded by script, the same sinuous looping language that filled the forbidden book. Around the spiral, tiny marks had been added in red, a sequence perhaps, or a notation of some kind. Anselm looked up. "Where did you find this?" "In a market," the man said, though his tone made it sound more like a riddle than a truth. "Or perhaps it found me." Anselm studied the paper again, noting the precision of the inkwork, the slight curl of the edges. It felt impossibly old, yet the ink was fresh, not faded. "You know what it means?" he asked. "I know it is meant to be opened," the man replied, "and I believe that you may be the one who can read what lies beyond the seal." Anselm felt a chill, though the air was not cold. "I am no seer," he murmured, "only a scribe. Even the smallest quill can unlock the greatest vault," the man said with a faint smile. "Do you not feel it, brother? The echo beneath your steps, the silence that hums louder than bells." Anselm thought of the vault, the warmth of the manuscript, the hum that followed the toll. "Who are you?" The man stood. "Only a traveler, passing, through old roads and older dreams." He turned to leave. "Wait," but he was already walking into the misty rain, his cloak blending into the grey, until he vanished beyond the abbey walls. Anselm sat alone, the parchment trembling slightly in his hand. The rain continued, soft and steady, as though the world itself was exhaling slowly. Later he brought the parchment to his cell, placing it beside the candlelight. The script shimmered faintly as if reluctant to be read. He copied the spiral into his journal, then the script, though he understood none of it. That night, as the abbey slept, the bell rang again. Once, then silence. And Anselm dreamed of the cloister flooded with golden light, and a door set into the earth that had never been there before. The candle had long burned out when the dream began. Brother Anselm lay still in his narrow bed, hands folded atop the woolen blanket, the silence of midnight thick around him. In the far corridors, the wind whispered through keyholes, a sound like breath drawn slowly through parted lips. In the dream, the abbey was not made of stone. It was formed of wood and root, as though the forest itself had remembered the shape of the cloisters and grown it into being. Walls twisted like trunks, and vaulted arches curled with leaves instead of carvings. Light seeped through gaps in the canopy above, dappled and golden, like sunlight passed through honey. Anselm stood in the center of the cloister, barefoot, the earth damp beneath his feet. He could hear chanting, but not in any tongue he knew. A hum of voices, deep and low, resonating in his chest like the sound of a cello string plucked beneath the ribs. The spiral was there too. It curled across the stone floor in moss and lichen, stretching toward the chapel. But where the chapel's great doors should have been, there stood a different kind of door. It was round, sunken into the earth, rimmed with bronze so aged it had turned green. Upon its face, carved in shallow relief, was a single eye. He stepped toward it. With each pace, the chanting grew softer, as though the voices retreated deeper underground. The air grew warmer, tinged with the scent of myrrh and something fainter, the smell of old ink and dry parchment. When he reached the door, his hand moved of its own accord, reaching not for a handle, for there was none, but placing. His palm flat against the bronze, it was warm, not metallic, not stone, but like skin faintly pulsing with a life of its own. The eye opened, not in a sudden movement, not jarring or abrupt, but like the petals of a flower unfolding in slow, morning light, and from its center not sight, but memory spilled forth. He saw a boy barefoot running along the banks of the River Wye. The boy was laughing, holding a carved wooden figure. Then, the same boy, older, kneeling beside a sickbed, whispering prayers. And then again, ink-stained and thin, sitting before a window copying lines of ancient Latin under candlelight. His own life, fragment by fragment, emerged from the door's eye. But as the images grew clearer, they began to shift. The boy's face turned, not to his own but to that of the strange traveler from the rain. The figure in the sickbed opened eyes glowing faintly gold. The candlelight flickered, not with wind, but with breath from lips unseen. Then the dream darkened, not with fear, but with vastness. The door swung inward, revealing only mist and a stair descending into an unseen depth. From below came a low bell, not ringing but resonating in a continuous tone. He stepped forward and woke. The cell was silent. The candle had long gone cold. Outside, the faint glow of false dawn filtered through the slit window. He sat, up slowly, feeling the dampness of sweat at his temples, the weight of the dream heavy on his chest. Then he saw it. Beneath his pillow, where nothing should ever be, lay a small object wrapped in vellum. His hands moved with reverent slowness, as though fearing it would vanish if rushed. The vellum unfolded with a whisper, revealing a fragment of bronze, a tiny disc, no larger than a coin, etched with the same eye from the door in his dream. Its surface was warm. He held it in his palm, the weight of it unfamiliar and unmistakably real. This was no fragment of imagination. It was a gift, or a message. He stood, dressing in the early cold, and made his way quietly through the Abbey's still halls, the disc clutched in his hand. The dream had led him here, and the waking world now bore its proof. He did not know yet what the door meant, nor the eye that had watched him so patiently. But he knew this. Something had begun, and there would be no returning to the silence before. The bronze disc remained warm long after the sun rose. Brother Anselm kept it close, tucked inside the folds of his robe, where its faint heat seemed to beat gently against his chest, not unlike a second heart. The morning light crept cautiously across the cloisters, pale and reluctant, as if uncertain whether it was welcome. The rain had passed, but the ground still wept quietly beneath the sodden grass. That morning, Anselm skipped breakfast. He wandered instead, his steps drawn by something he could not name. It was not a voice, not in the usual sense. There were no words, no melodies, and yet it called. a low vibration that moved not through his ears, but through the bones of his spine, rising and falling like the slow swell of the sea. He called it the chant, soundless, yet insistent. A presence. He passed the refectory and the chapter house, the scriptorium and the inner garden, each place seeming faintly thinner than it had the day before, like a parchment scraped too many times. The air shimmered at the edges, and shadows lingered longer than they should. Eventually, his steps brought him to the east wing, the part of the abbey long since closed to daily use. The halls here were colder, filled with the breath of stone and disuse. Dust floated in the slanted light, each mote like a memory that had lost its name. He paused before a narrow door. It was warped with time, its hinges kissed with rust. But the spiral pattern was there again, faintly carved into the wood, almost obscured by age. He did not recall seeing it before. He pressed the bronze disc gently to it. The door opened without resistance. Inside was a small oratory, a private place of prayer once used by a single monk, long gone. The room was still, draped in old linen coverings, icons leaning slightly. From where time had loosened their moorings, dust lay thick and cobwebs framed the corners like forgotten veils. Anselm stepped inside. The chant grew louder, though still without sound. It vibrated now in his fingertips, across the base of his skull, resonating with the very air in the room. On the far wall hung a tapestry. Its threads had dulled, but the image was unmistakable. A round door set in stone, encircled by flames and flowers, and above it an eye, open and watching. He felt his breath catch. In the corner of the room was a small lectern, covered with a cloth. Anselm moved toward it, lifting the veil slowly. Beneath lay a thin book, hand-bound, its cover worn smooth with use. The script on its spine was nearly erased, but he could still make out the first word, Vigilia. Vigil. He opened it. The pages were filled not with prayers, but with symbols. Repeating spirals, sketches of doors, diagrams of stars with lines connecting them in angular lattices. Beside each drawing were annotations, in Latin this time, but tangled and poetic. The door remembers the foot that never passed. Not. All voices are meant to be heard with ears. The chant is the echo of your future walking backward. He turned the final page. There, scrawled in a more hurried hand, was a name, Brother Aldwin. Anselm froze. Aldwin, the monk who had vanished. 32 years prior, one day present, the next gone. No trace, no farewell. Only his cell left undisturbed, his possessions waiting in stillness. And now here this oratory, this book, forgotten by time, remembered by no one, and yet clearly touched by the same force that now reached out to Anselm. The chant was louder now. He closed the book and sat quietly before the tapestry. The image stared back at him, the eye calm and endless. He did not pray, not in words. He simply breathed, letting the rhythm of the chant move through him like the tide. His thoughts softened, frayed at the edges. Time seemed to thin. He remembered a day from boyhood, chasing fireflies along a hedgerow, the light just fading from the sky. He remembered the smell of candle wax, of his mother's bread, of warm wool after rain. And then the bell. Not from above. Not from the tower, but from below. A single tone, deep, slow, as if the stone beneath the abbey had remembered something and rung its answer in reply. Anselm stood. He did not know where this path led, but it had begun long before him, perhaps even before Aldwin, a circle unbroken, now drawing inward again. He left the oratory quietly, and as he closed the door, the spiral carved in the wood shimmered faintly and vanished. The air beneath the abbey was different. It did not move as air did above. It lingered, thick and unmoved, as though too old to be stirred by mere breath or movement. Brother Anselm descended slowly, one hand trailing the damp stone wall beside. Him, the bronze disc pulsing faintly in his pocket like a quiet heartbeat. He had found the hidden stair by accident, or perhaps by design. After leaving the oratory, he had wandered through the oldest part of the abbey, past the apse where sunlight rarely touched, past doors sealed by time, until he noticed a draught beneath a tapestry he had never paid attention to. Behind it, a recess. Within it, a handle. The stones protested as he pulled, but opened nonetheless. The steps beyond curved downward in a spiral. Again the spiral, as though he descended through the very symbol that had begun to haunt his days and nights. The deeper he went, the more the chant returned, not louder but clearer. No longer mere vibration, but now the faintest hint of harmony, tones too low and wide for voices, like the sound of wind in a canyon or of a bell, rung in a dream. The stair ended in darkness. Anselm lit a taper, the tiny flame blooming like a hesitant flower in the black. Before him stretched a narrow passage, walls closed, carved not with tools but with time. Symbols were etched into the stone, not letters but shapes, circles within circles, hourglasses with sand flowing up instead of down, and doors that opened inward into themselves. He followed the passage. It was neither cold nor warm. The air had no temperature and only a weight like old thoughts. With each step, he felt he moved not just through space but through memory. Not his alone but collective, as if the very stones remembered the feet that had passed here long ago. At last, the passage opened. A chamber, circular, low-ceilinged, the walls covered in dry lichen. In its center stood a pedestal. Upon it, an hourglass. It was large, almost as tall as his chest, encased in bronze filigree shaped like climbing vines. The sand within was white as bone, fine as powdered light, and it was moving, not down but up. Anselm approached, feeling the chant grow intimate, like a whisper at the nape of the neck. He watched the sand rise. Each grain lifted itself from the bottom and floated upward through the narrow throat of the glass, not falling but unfalling, returning perhaps to a moment that had not yet passed. He reached out, fingers brushing the glass. It was warm. Not merely warm, alive, and in that touch a vision. He saw the abbey, but not as it was. It was being built, wooden scaffolds, stone carried by hand, voices raised in song and sweat. Then it was older. He saw monks younger than any he, Sanju copying texts that no longer existed, laughing, crying, praying. Time unfolded like a book read in reverse. He saw Brother Aldwin, not lost, but kneeling before this very hourglass, his hands trembling. Then another monk, and another. Faces flickering by like pages turned too fast to read. Finally his own face, not now but from before, from a time he did not remember, standing beside the hourglass, placing a hand upon it. This has happened. The thought was not his, but it moved through him, and will happen again. He pulled his hand away. The vision ended. The chant receded, not gone, but satisfied. He stood in silence, only the faint sound of the sand rising marking the passage of, not time, no. Something else, perhaps memory, perhaps intention. There were no answers here. Only symbols, the spiral, the door, the eye, and now, the hourglass, defying gravity, history, finality. He sat on the stone floor, feeling its cool solidity beneath him. Here, beneath the earth, where clocks did not tick and bells did not toll, something ancient moved without movement. Time did not pass. It returned, it waited, it watched, and Anselm, now more witness than monk, let himself be still. Outside, the world turned as it always had, but here below, the hour did not pass. It listened. The passage back to the surface felt longer than Anselm remembered. Each step upward was a gentle protest, as though the stones themselves had become reluctant to let him go. The spiral staircase seemed to twist a degree more tightly, the air gaining texture, not quite resistance, but weight. And still the hourglass pulsed in his memory, each grain of backward sand as vivid as a candle-lit prayer. When he finally emerged into the main corridor of the abbey, the world felt quieter. Not silent, but paused. The birds, usually chorusing in the rafters or perched among the yews, were absent. The wind, so constant around the hilltop abbey, had stilled. Even the ancient creaks of wood and stone that gave the old building its nightly voice had gone dormant. Anselm walked the cloisters slowly. His footsteps did not echo. He paused by the old well in the inner courtyard, peering into the water, and saw no reflection. The surface was still like dark glass, but his face did not greet him. Only the stone wall behind, faintly warped, stared back. He blinked, leaned closer. Still nothing. He dipped his hand into the water. It was cold, real, wet. But when he withdrew it, the ripples calmed, and the surface returned to its blank gaze. Later, in the scriptorium, he tested it again. A polished bronze basin used for ink preparation, usually full of cloudy reflections. Nothing. The face that had aged so gently in the mirror of each morning, the furrowed brow, the white-streaked beard, the eyes that had seen 1,000 sunsets through abbey windows, was no longer visible. Not erased, simply absent. Yet his body was not absent. He could feel, breathe, think. The world still greeted his touch and step. Only his reflection had ceased. He told no one. There were few monks left in St. Ethelred's Abbey now. Age had thinned their numbers, and silence had spread like moss over empty cells. He carried this mystery as he had carried many, inwardly with reverence and calm. That evening, as clouds bloomed gold and crimson beyond the arches, he returned to the library. It was a room he knew well, almost too well. The scent of vellum and oak, the dust that never fully settled, the small marks he himself had made in the margins of ancient folios. Yet even here, something had changed. The far wall, lined with neglected cabinets, one now stood ajar. He did not remember it ever opening. Within was a mirror. He approached cautiously. It was framed in a twisted wood, the grain of it spiraling inward, and at its corners were tiny brass hinges, suggesting it once folded closed like a triptych. But now it was open, facing the world. The glass was black, not merely dark, but void, not absorbing light, but replacing it. It did not show the room behind him or himself or even the flickering candle he held. It showed something else. He leaned in. At first only shapes, faint outlines of figures moving through shadow, slow and deliberate. Then a face, a child, pale and wide-eyed, staring through the glass as though through a window. Not Anselm, not anyone he knew. Then another, an old woman, weeping softly into her hands, seated by a hearth. Then a knight, in armor, bent over a scroll, lips moving as if in prayer. They flickered past, not fast, not rushed, but with the grace of drifting smoke. Each scene silent, yet filled with meaning he could feel but not name. They were memories, but not his. The mirror was not for reflection, he realized. It was for witnessing, a window not into what one is, but into what one has forgotten, or perhaps into what others remembered in his place. He stood for a long time, letting the visions pass through him, like wind through a field. There was no fear, only a sense of widening, as if his soul, once folded neatly within him, was now being gently unfurled. The last image was different. It was the library itself, but empty, dusty. A single book open on the table, the same volume he had copied last year, the margin still holding his notation, and behind the book a figure, cloaked, hooded, standing utterly still, not watching him, waiting for him. Then darkness. The mirror returned to black. He stepped back, feeling the cold of the floor seep into his feet. Whatever this was, it was not new. It had waited a long time, and now it seemed it remembered him. The memory of the mirror lingered like perfume in Anselm's thoughts, subtle, haunting, and impossible to ignore. That night he lay awake long after the bells of Compline had faded, staring at the ceiling of his cell, its low arch brushed. With moonlight, he thought not of sleep, but of the cloaked figure in the mirror. It had not spoken, had not moved. And yet its stillness was an invitation, or perhaps a summons. The next morning, after the sun had risen pale and hesitant over the eastern hills, Anselm returned to the library. The mirror was still there, but it reflected only darkness now. He bowed slightly to it, not out of superstition but out of respect, and turned his attention to the shelves behind. Something had shifted. There was a faint seam in the stone wall, barely perceptible, where the mortar lines didn't quite align. Books that had sat untouched for decades had fallen into unnatural patterns, as if nudged. As if something behind the wall had pressed outward, Anselm ran his fingers along the seam. The mortar crumbled under his touch. Behind it, a wooden panel dark with age. It slid aside more easily than it should have, revealing a narrow door no taller than his chest. A crawl space, perhaps, or something older. He fetched a lamp, lit it with steady hands, and knelt before the opening. Inside was a passage choked with dust and cobwebs, the scent of forgotten incense heavy in the air. He crawled forward, the hem of his robe catching on stone and splinters. The light from the library faded quickly behind him, swallowed by the dark. The tunnel curved left, then down, and ended in a wooden hatch. Anselm pushed it open. He emerged, into a room. It was not large, no more than a storehouse perhaps once used for sacred objects, but it had not been entered in decades, perhaps longer. Dust coated every surface, and thick webs draped from beams like old lace. Shelves lined the walls, filled with chalices, patens, incense holders, each covered in a silent shroud of disuse. But in the center of the room stood a pedestal. Upon it, a statue, wooden, no taller than a child, carved from a single piece of dark oak, its surface smooth but aged. The figure wore robes like those of a monk, hands clasped in prayer. Its head was bowed slightly. Anselm approached slowly. His lamp illuminated the face, and he stopped. It was his own, not merely similar, not a resemblance shaped by bias or imagination, but exact. Every line, every furrow of brow, the small scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood fall. It was there. He stared. The figure seemed asleep, a mirror of peace, or perhaps resignation. A younger version of himself, still unlined by time, still unburdened. He reached out, his fingers brushing the wooden cheek. Warm, not in the way wood should be after centuries in the dark. Alive. He stepped back. His heart did not race. There was no fear, only a gentle disquiet, the way one feels when finding their own name in an old book they've never read. Behind the statue was a small plaque, barely legible beneath the grime. He wiped it clean. The inscription was Latin, but not ordinary scripture. He who watches beneath must forget before he may remember. Below it the date, nearly a century ago. Anselm sat beside the pedestal, the lamp casting soft shadows on the shelves. He remembered little of his early days in the abbey. He had been young, barely a man, taken in after a storm destroyed the hamlet of his birth. His memories of that time were fragmented. Kindness, silence, books, and a sense of being watched over. Had this always been here? Had he seen it before? Was the statue carved in his likeness, or had he grown into its form? The question sat with him like a second presence in the room. Time again seemed to hesitate around him. Not stop, not flee, but bend softly. He did not pray. He simply sat, listening to the dust settle, to the silence breathe, to something, someone within himself awaken. The hours passed slowly in the hidden chamber, measured only by the flicker of Anselm's lamp and the occasional settling groan of timber above. He remained seated before the statue, his statue, contemplating not what it was, but why it was. He did not ask aloud. The room was not a place for questions, only for recognition. The inscription at the base still echoed in his mind. He who watches beneath must forget before he may remember. The words turned slowly in his thoughts like a prayer wheel, revealing no single meaning, only layers. Forget to remember, lose to retrieve, unbecome to become. As he sat in stillness, a new sound came, subtle, soft as breath, through parchment. It wasn't wind, it was a whisper. Not words exactly, but syllables without meaning that curled at the edge of understanding. It came from the wall, not behind the statue, but the far wall, where the shadows clung more tightly. He stood lifting his lamp. The flame wavered, reluctant but held. The whispering continued. He pressed his hand to the stone. It vibrated faintly, like a page trembling before a turning. There was no door, no seam, but the wall itself felt hollow, not in its structure but in its presence. He didn't try to force it. Instead, he turned and crawled back through the narrow passage to the library. The mirror was black once more, waiting. Anselm scanned the shelves. He knew these books. He had catalogued them, copied them, cradled their bindings like fragile memories. But something new caught his eye, not new in form, but in feeling. It was a thin volume bound in leather, the color of dried leaves. No title, no mark, just a faint spiral pressed into the spine, barely visible unless the light struck it right. He pulled it from the shelf. Dust fell like old breath. When he opened it, there were no words, only blank pages. And yet, he remembered, not in the way one remembers a story read long ago, but as if he had lived it. Each blank page called up an image in his mind, a place, a voice, a moment, the texture of a dream long buried. One page showed him a garden, not of this world, but of memory, where flowers bloomed only at night and sang when touched by. Another revealed a great hall beneath the abbey, filled with monks who never spoke, their mouths sewn closed with silver thread, yet who communed through thought and silence. Another, a child running through endless corridors, chased not by monsters, but by questions without answers. He flipped through quickly, breath-catching, not from fear, but recognition. This was not a book to read. This was a book to remember. He realized then, the book was not blank. He was the text. Each page aligned with a layer of his being, a history not written in ink, but in essence. The whispering from the wall returned, stronger now, as though pleased, encouraging. He closed the book. Its presence lingered in his hands like warmth from a long embrace. He did not return it to the shelf. He cradled it as one would carry a candle through the wind. He walked the abbey halls slowly, the book in his hands, listening. The voices did not speak in tongues he could name. They unfolded. Some were memories not his. A woman singing in the snow, a man weeping beneath a broken arch, a child lighting a lamp with hands that trembled not from cold but hope. Others were his, Dreams once dismissed, fears once forgotten, joys too gentle to last. They led him to the nave, vast and empty in the evening light. Candles guttered in the alcoves. Shadows leaned long from the columns. And there in the center of the stone floor, where once processions had passed, a spiral was carved, so faint as to be nearly erased. He knelt at its center, opened the book. Once more, this time the pages glowed faintly, not light. Memory. His own, and not. The abbey, he realized, was not just a place of worship. It was a vessel, a library of souls, a structure built not only to house monks and manuscripts, but to remember what the world forgot, what the world could no longer bear. And in some way he, Anselm, had become its page, had always been. He closed the book slowly, reverently. The whispering ceased, only the sound of his breath remained, soft and somehow shared. He was not alone. Not anymore. The book remained with him, not as a possession, but as a companion. Anselm no longer felt the urge to speak. Silence had become his breath, the way stillness is to stone, not absence, but presence in its most complete form. He wandered the abbey not aimlessly, but intuitively, as though each step responded to a chord deep within the walls. The patterns of the flagstones whispered beneath his feet. The cracks in the plaster hummed like old verses. Even the dust seemed arranged with purpose, like ash after a sacred fire. The sun had nearly reached its zenith when he returned to the chapel, the same place he had knelt countless times, but now he did not kneel. He stood before the altar, the book pressed gently to his chest, and he listened. There, beneath the hymnal platform, a soft thrum, a sound not heard with ears, but felt in the spine. It pulsed slowly, like a deep and ancient drumbeat. He moved aside the old cloth, revealing the floor beneath. There was no lock, no hinge, only a faint outline in the stone. A door not cut, but grown. The spiral shape again, though now etched, not with tools but with time and patience. He placed his palm in the center. The silence deepened, thickening around him like fog. His breath stilled, his thoughts quieted. The stone moved, not abruptly. It softened, as wax before flame, and dissolved into itself. A passage revealed, downward, steep, veiled in warm darkness. He stepped in. There was no need for a lamp. The walls glowed faintly, like moonlight caught in moss. But these walls were not stone, not quite. They curved and pulsed like ribs of a slumbering creature. The scent here was not of mildew or dampness, but of old ink, beeswax and myrrh. The abbey was alive, not metaphorically, truly, a being unto itself, not a house of God, but a body of memory, each passage a vein of thought, each chamber a lung of prayer, each stone a cell of devotion. Anselm walked slowly, reverently, his fingertips brushing the soft, breathing walls. The deeper he went, the more he felt his own breath begin to echo the rhythm of the place. In, out. In, out. He was no longer walking through the abbey. He was part of it. Its pulse became his, its silence, his mind. The corridor opened into a vast chamber, circular, like so much else in this journey. The walls here bore no markings, no tapestries, no signs, only texture, folds and curves like those of an ear listening eternally. In the center, a shallow pool. He approached. The water was not water. It shimmered like memory, like dream. And when he looked into it, he saw not his face, but moments. His mother brushing ash from his cheek after the fire. The first time he tasted bread baked by another monk. The day he first felt the weight of a quill in his fingers. But also, the moment he was found, as a child, wandering the abbey ruins, long, before he ever arrived, a circle, his life, returning, not repeating but completing. He touched the surface. Ripples bloomed, and from them, images, faces he had never seen, but felt he knew. A woman with eyes like stormlight, a child clutching a wooden toy. An elder reciting stories to the wind. He understood. He was not just Anselm, he was one of many. The abbey remembered all who had passed through, and now, through the book, through the mirror, through the hourglass, he remembered them, not as names but as feelings. He sat beside the pool, closed his eyes. The chant returned, not from without, but from within. He hummed it softly. It was not melody, it was recognition. The abbey did not hold prayers, it was the prayer. And Anselm, now fully, part of its breath sat in perfect stillness, not waiting, not seeking, simply being. The air in the chamber was neither warm nor cool. It was aware. Brother Anselm sat beside the shimmering pool of memory, his hands resting lightly on his knees, as the chant within him softened to a steady breath. The gentle ripples from his touch had long since faded, but the surface of the pool still shimmered, alive with unseen currents. He did not feel the passage of time. Time, here, was not linear. It curled and settled, like leaves on water, always moving, always returning. And then, slowly, they came. He did not hear them arrive. There were no footsteps, no rustle of robes, only the subtle shift of presence, the way a room feels different when someone enters, even in silence. Across the chamber a figure stood, tall, robed, hands hidden in long sleeves. Its face was indistinct, not by shadow, but by the soft blur of memory, like a candle seen through linen. It inclined its head. Anselm nodded gently in return. Another figure emerged, this one smaller, a woman perhaps, or a youth. Her hands cupped something invisible, and as she moved closer she offered it to him. He felt no weight, but the gesture warmed him, a gift of something once forgotten, now shared. They did not speak. Their language was movement. One placed a hand over their heart, then extended it outward, as though returning a memory long held in secret. Another knelt beside the pool, placing a finger to the surface, and for a brief moment an image appeared. A monk, young, joyful, spinning in the rain with arms outstretched, laughter echoing in the storm. Anselm felt it in his ribs. It was not his memory, but it lived now in him. These were not ghosts. They were not echoes. They were presences, souls not departed, but held, not in stasis, but in resonance. The abbey had not forgotten them. They had not forgotten themselves. And now through him they remembered each other. More figures arrived. A child whose eyes held the weight of many winters. An old man who walked without touching the ground. A woman with ink-stained fingers, and a smile like a summer hymn. Each brought a memory, not as story but as gift. Anselm felt them settle into his bones, not heavily but gently, as though he were not merely receiving, but returning something that had always belonged. They did not overwhelm him. They completed him. He began to understand. The abbey had always been more than stone and ritual. It was a cradle, a keeper of sacred forgetting and sacred remembering. A soul does not vanish, not truly. It waits, sometimes in the branches of a tree, sometimes in the pages of a forgotten book, and sometimes in the breath of a monk who listens closely enough. Anselm stood. He did not feel alone. Not now, not ever again. The figures began to move, not away but around, forming a slow, gentle circle around the pool. Their hands linked, their presence humming in harmony with the abbey's pulse. The chant returned, not from within, but from all around. It was not a song, it was a breath, and Anselm breathed with them, a part of the circle, a part of the memory, part of the abbey, When he finally closed his eyes, it was not to sleep, it was to remember, and in remembering he became whole. The chamber hummed, not with sound but with knowing. Brother Anselm stood within the ring of presences, no longer mere monk, no longer only Anselm. He was still himself, yes, but also more. The memories of others had settled into him like rain, into soil, and something within him had begun to grow. The air shimmered slightly. He noticed it first at the edge of his hands, a faint glow, like the memory of candlelight. It did not illuminate the room. It illuminated him, not his skin, his being. He raised his hand. Where flesh had once defined the limit of self, there was now a soft boundary, not quite form, not quite formless. His hand was not vanishing. It was becoming, like breath leaving. The body ducks not gone but transformed. Around him the other figures watched, not with eyes but with presence. Their approval was not spoken but felt. The air accepted him. The abbey accepted him. He knelt once more before the pool. This time the surface did not reflect. It welcomed. He placed his fingertips upon it, and the pool rose to meet them. Not water, not memory, but something in between, a connection, a communion. He saw not images this time, but threads, golden, silver, coppery red, weaving through space, connecting moments, people, places. Some threads looped back, some stretched far, some tangled gently, never cut. He saw his own thread, and how it had passed through others, gently, sometimes imperceptibly, shaping paths, offering silence, listening where no one else had, and he saw where it led now, not to an end, to an opening. Anselm stood. The glow at his edges deepened, not brightness, but clarity. The outlines of his robes wavered, the folds of cloth slowly softening into shape without matter. His feet still touched the floor, but he felt no weight. He looked toward the others. They nodded, or something like nodding, and one by one they stepped forward. Each placed a hand upon his shoulder, not with gravity, but with gratitude. They did not speak, but he heard them nonetheless, not in words, in feeling. You are remembered, you are remembering. You are what remains when memory is made sacred. One figure, the child with the stormlight eyes, reached up and touched his chest. A sound emerged, soft, low, not a word, not a name, but a note, a pure, lingering tone that resonated in the walls, in his bones, in the very breath of the abbey. Anselm sang in return. He did not know how he knew the note, but he did. His voice, and not his voice, rose to meet it, and together the two tones wove a third, richer than both. And then another joined from one of the silent monks, then another, until the chamber was filled with a sound like morning, soft, golden, full. The abbey sang, and Anselm sang with it. Not a hymn of praise, a hymn of presence, of being, of silence. Made whole, he felt himself stretching, not outward, inward, as though all the spaces he had left hollow, in grief, in wonder, in humility, were now filling with light that had no source, only destination. He was not vanishing. He was arriving. He thought of the vines along the cloister wall, how they wrapped gently around the stones, not overtaking, but becoming part of their strength. He was the vine, he was the stone. He was the chant in the bell that never rang, the shimmer on the water that held no reflection, the page in the book that held no ink. He was the pause between words in every prayer. And, as the final note faded, Anselm smiled, not with lips, with light. Anselm no longer walked. He moved, not through space, but through meaning. The corridors of the abbey, once solid and cool beneath his feet, were now like the pages of a vast, open book. He could feel the breath of every wall, every stone, not just their form, but their memory. He passed through a hallway and paused beside a fracture in the stone. To any other eye it would seem no more than time's small signature, a crack, perhaps from shifting ground or old age. But Anselm placed his hand upon it, and the wall spoke, not in sound, in sensation. A story unfolded in his chest. A monk, long ago, had leaned here, late one night, sobbing silently after writing a letter he would never send. His tears had dried before they touched the floor, and yet the wall remembered them. The grief was still warm. Anselm moved on. He came to the base of the bell tower. Here, beneath layers of dust and shadow, he saw the faint outline of a handprint on the old wooden beam. He laid his own palm atop it. A vision stirred. Two young monks forbidden to ring the bell after dark had done so anyway, not in rebellion, but in celebration of the spring's first stars. Their laughter still echoed faintly in the wood, like a bird's wing passing through a dream. Anselm smiled. These memories were not recorded. They were received, and now relived. In the scriptorium, he brushed his fingers across the long desk where he had once labored over texts. Beneath the worn grain of oak, he felt the imprint of countless hands, not just his own, hands trembling with faith, hands cracked from cold, hands aching from loss, hands that wrote not for glory, but for stillness. He bent close. The desk whispered prayers in languages no longer spoken, yet he understood each one, not as words but as breath, as heartbeat. In the dormitory he touched the stone by the foot of his bed. There a young novice, long before Anselm's time, had hidden a token, a small shell from a pilgrimage never taken. The dream of the journey had been enough. The abbey had kept it safe. Even the stairs had stories. As he moved between levels, each step told of sandals worn thin by years of service. Of laughter as snow fell outside, of quiet fear during times of plague, when monks passed one another without a word, each wondering who would be next. Anselm did not grieve. These were not sad things. They were whole things, truths folded into walls and wood and silence. And now, as part of the abbey, he could read them all. The abbey was not only a memory, it was a mind. It dreamed through stone, it breathed through dust. It remembered him, not just as a monk, but as a presence, a page, a whisper within its body, and he remembered it, not as a building, but as a soul. At dusk he returned to the cloister garden. The yews stood watch, their roots deep in stories untold. The wind, gentle now, passed through the arches with a sound like a page turning. Anselm sat beneath the tree he had often rested beside in youth. Its bark bore no inscription, and yet, when he laid his palm against it, he felt 1,000 afternoons rise into the air, bees buzzing in late summer, the smell of parchment and bread, the sound of Brother Edric humming to himself as he pruned the herbs. The abbey had no need for books. It was a book, and he, at last, could read it. The abbey was quiet, as it always was, but now Anselm heard the quiet differently. He heard the weight of unwritten words, the hush between footsteps that had once passed, the silent gratitude left behind after prayers. The stillness was not emptiness. It was fullness, waiting. He followed a sensation, not a direction but a draw, like a leaf pulled gently by a stream. He moved through arches older than memory, past alcoves where lamps had long since gone out. His feet no longer touched the floor as they once had. He floated softly like thought. There was a corridor he did not know. It had no door, no light, but it welcomed him. He passed through the threshold like water, and the air changed. Inside was a room, circular once again, always the circle, the abbey's breath, the wheel turning gently inward and inward. This room had no name. It had never needed one. There were no windows, no altar, no bench, only the floor, smooth, unmarked, except at its center where a shallow depression held a single object, a sphere perfectly round, not stone, not metal, something else. It pulsed gently, like a heartbeat heard in dream. Anselm approached. He felt no fear, only reverence. He sat before the sphere and waited, not for it to speak, but for himself to quiet enough to hear. No voice came, but a presence, did not in shape, in absence. He understood in that moment that this was the place where voices ended, not because they were lost, because they had arrived. The monks who had lived, prayed, struggled, laughed, each had at some point passed through here, not physically, not always, but in essence, when the last word left their lips, when the final echo of their chant faded into the walls, they had come here and remained, not as spirits, as completion. Anselm touched the sphere. He felt nothing. And in that nothing, everything. He remembered the bell that never rang. He now understood why. It had rung, but not through sound, through presence. The abbey itself had tolled, slowly, softly, calling not ears, but awareness, calling him. This was the answer. Not knowledge, but silence. Not closure, but presence. He sat for what might have been an hour, a year, a breath. And when he stood, the sphere dimmed. Not gone, simply no longer waiting. It had received. Anselm turned. The room shimmered faintly as he passed. Out of it not goodbye, but completion. The abbey breathed again, and so did he. Morning returned to the abbey as it always did, quietly, with soft light slipping through tall windows, gilding the dust in the air like suspended breath. The bells remained silent, but no one missed them. The monks stirred, as they had each day for years beyond count. They rose from their narrow beds, washed in cold water, and offered their first prayers with bowed heads. The ritual was unchanged, and yet something had shifted. Brother Matthew, as he stepped into the cloister garden, paused mid-stride. The air smelled different, not of herbs or rain, but something gentler, like vellum warmed by sun, like wool that had wrapped laughter once. He could not name it. He only smiled. Brother Elias, who rarely smiled, found himself humming in the refectory while sorting dried beans. The tune had no beginning and no name, just a lilt, like the turning of a page or the stirring of wind in the chapel rafters. He did not know why he hummed, only that it felt right. Brother Thomas, the youngest, swore. He heard breathing in the scriptorium, not from the other monks, but from the walls themselves. He would glance up, expecting to see someone behind him, only to find the shadows unchanged. But he was never afraid. If anything, he felt more accompanied than ever. The abbey had always been still. Now it listened back. Anselm did not walk among them, not as before. His robes no longer rustled, his feet no longer tapped across the flagstones. His hands no longer smudged the corners of pages with ink or oil. But he was there, in the glint of light on the lectern, in the way the garden gate creaked at just the right moment, never startling, in the silence between lines of chant, where something warm settled in the chest before the next verse began. He had become not memory, but presence. In the great hall where novices gathered to read aloud the rule, one of them stopped mid-sentence. I felt, but did not finish. He looked around. The others only nodded. They had felt it too. Not a chill, a hush, a grace. Later that week, Brother Edric, half blind now but still tending the bees, found a candle lit in the old oratory. No one claimed to have been there. The wick was fresh, The flame did not flicker in the breeze. It stood steady and sure. He left it burning without question. In the margins of books, new annotations appeared, not full phrases, but single, gentle marks. A spiral, a dot of ink where none had been before, not vandalism, invitation. And when Brother Thomas once fell asleep over his copying, he dreamt of a man sitting beside him, face aglow not with light, but with familiarity. The man did not speak, only placed a hand on his shoulder. Thomas awoke and wept, though he did not know why. The abbey had always kept time. Now it held something else, a breath, a thought, a monk who had not left, who had not died, who had simply remained, not in defiance of time, but as its echo, as its blessing. Anselm was not a ghost. He was not waiting. He was not lost. He was home, and every stone knew his name. The abbey no longer waited. It moved, not in haste, not with purpose, but with rhythm, like a slow tide, returning always to the shore of the soul. Brother Anselm was part of that rhythm now, though no footstep marked his path, no word echoed. His will, his presence wove through the days like thread through linen, not seen, not touched, but felt. It began with small things. A book left open to the exact page Brother Matthew needed, a passage on stillness he would later read aloud, not knowing who had placed it there. A broken quill replaced on Brother Elias's desk before he returned from prayer, though no one had passed that way. The herb garden, long neglected, slowly began to thrive again. No hands were seen tilling the soil, and yet the rows of rosemary and sage stood taller, greener, more orderly. None of the monks spoke of it, yet all of them adjusted their step just slightly when passing the central cloister, as if making room, as if acknowledging something sacred shared the path. Brother Thomas, walking the eastern corridor at dusk, found himself pausing by the old tapestry with the spiral. He touched it lightly, and felt beneath the fabric a warmth that traveled up his arm like sunlight. He did not move for several minutes. Later, he began copying an ancient hymn none of the others had thought to preserve. The melody came to him not from memory but from silence, as if silence itself had begun to sing. In the refectory, bowls were placed with greater care, not from obligation but from awareness. In the chapel, chants gained an extra breath of unity, a harmony never rehearsed yet always exact. No one taught these things, no one commanded them, they simply happened. And the abbey, the walls, the wood, the light that filtered through stained glass, seemed to hum gently in return. Not a sound, a recognition. Anselm, now breath woven through stone, had not become something new. He had simply become fully what he had always been, a guide, a stillness that led, not forward, but inward. Sometimes, late at night, Brother Edric would sit alone by the cloister fountain. He would whisper to the air, not expecting reply. But once, just once, he heard a ripple in the water that matched his breath, and he smiled as though greeted. Sometimes a novice would forget a verse, only for his voice to be caught, supported, finished by another, who claimed not to have spoken. Sometimes a candle would flicker to life when no one struck a match, not magic, not miracle, only memory made kind, only presence made gentle. The abbey did not need renovation. It needed only remembrance. And now, with Anselm as part of its rhythm, remembrance was everywhere. The stones softened. The shadows no longer clung. Even the silence felt less empty, not hollow, hallowed. One morning, Brother Thomas awoke from a dream. In it, he had followed a monk down a corridor he did not recognize. The monk never turned, never spoke, only walked. Steady, sure. When Thomas called out, the monk finally paused and turned slightly, not revealing his face but offering something in his hand, a key. Thomas took it, and in the dream, the walls opened, not physically, meaningfully. When he awoke, he found a small key in his blanket fold, old brass, simple. He said nothing, only kept it close, and began to listen more carefully, just as Anselm once had. The first frost of the season had settled on the fields when the boy arrived. He came wrapped in a woolen shawl too large for him, trailing behind like a shadow. His boots were worn thin, his hands tucked tightly beneath his arms. Beside him stood a man from the village, silent, hat in hand. He spoke only once. His name is Emmerich. Then he turned and left. The gatekeeper watched the boy for a long moment before leading him inside. The boy said nothing. His eyes moved constantly, not in fear but in deep, quiet attention. The abbey accepted him without question. Rooms were always made ready for such arrivals, not by design, by rhythm. Brother Edric fetched blankets. Brother Elias poured warm broth. Brother Matthew, without knowing why, placed an old, small wooden comb by the bedside in the novice dormitory. No one told the boy what to expect, and he did not ask. The first night, Emmerich did not sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling beams, listening. There were no voices, no sounds, and yet he felt he was not alone, not watched, accompanied. At some point, long after the candles had guttered low, he sat up and looked across the room. In the dark, a shape moved. Not a figure, a feeling. The air stirred softly as if someone had just left or just arrived. He lay back down, and for the first time in many nights he dreamed. In the dream, he walked through a hallway filled with books. None had titles. None had locks, yet each one, when touched, played a note, not of music but of recognition. He passed book after book, hearing these tones, some warm, some cold, some like a question, and one at the end, silent. He opened it. Inside, a single page, a name, not his, but it felt like his. When he awoke, he remembered nothing but the warmth, the Days passed gently. He was given chores, sweeping the walkways, sorting dried herbs, fetching water from the old pump. He never complained. His hands were quick, and his eyes watched everything. The way Brother Elias folded his sleeves, the way Brother Thomas hummed before each meal. One morning, as frost still hugged the corners of the cloister stones, Emmerich passed the chapel. Doran paused. He heard singing, but there was no one inside, only the morning light through stained glass. Still he stepped in. The air inside was warmer, not in temperature, in tone. He walked slowly to the center of the room, looked up at the high vaults. A beam of light touched his forehead. For a moment he felt, not tall but placed, like a bookmark returned to its page. He smiled, not with his mouth, with his breath. Later he found an old book on a shelf behind the refectory, a volume of chants, dog-eared and water-warped. When he opened it, he found a page marked with a dry sprig of rosemary. The song on that page was familiar. Though he had never heard it before, he hummed it that evening as he swept the cloister path, and the wind seemed to pause to listen. Anselm, or the memory that had once been Anselm, moved gently through the abbey that night. He passed by the dormitory, paused at the foot of the boy's bed. The boy was asleep, curled small, breathing slowly. A hand, not physical, brushed the edge of the blanket, not to protect, to bless. Anselm did not speak, but the abbey did. The stones hummed softly. The floor beneath the boy's bed warmed slightly, and somewhere in the upper rafters, a single owl stirred. Anne settled again. The abbey had always remembered. Now it began again with a boy at the gate. It was a week into his stay when Emmerich began to listen with more than his ears. He did not know how it started. Perhaps it had always been there, just beneath the sound of sweeping, beneath the morning chants, beneath the soft scrape of wooden bowls on stone tables. But now he felt it. The walls had moods. Some corridors were sleepy, as if recently woken. Some beams above the chapel creaked not from age but from remembering. Even the garden, quiet and orderly, had places where the breeze lingered just a second longer, like a hand resting gently on a shoulder. Emmerich never spoke of these things. He didn't know how to name them. He only moved accordingly. If the cloister shadows stretched longer than usual, he swept there first. If the library felt particularly still, he placed the books back slower, pausing between shelves as if acknowledging each one. One morning, as frost began to melt into dew, he walked by the old refectory door and stopped. It was closed, but inside someone was crying. He didn't open the door. He only pressed his small hand to the wood, leaned his forehead against it and whispered a wordless breath, like a lullaby hummed for no one, to no one, with all the care in the world. The crying stopped. He never asked who it was, and no one ever mentioned it. That afternoon the rain came, soft, steady, like memory falling from the sky. Most monks stayed indoors, tending books or prayers. But Emmerich walked the cloisters slowly, bareheaded, letting the cold drops trace lines on his cheeks. The stones were slick but familiar underfoot. The rhythm of his steps and the rain made a kind of quiet duet. Something pulled at him, not with urgency, with patience. He followed it. Past the old scriptorium, down a corridor that curved slightly left, a part of the abbey he had not yet learned. The air grew colder, the walls tighter, not menacing. Not, just quiet in a different tone. There, behind a stack of unused chairs and a cracked basin, was a narrow wooden panel. It did not look like a door, but it was. He pressed his hand to it. It opened without sound. Inside was a tiny room, barely large, enough to stand in. Dust hung thick like silence. Cobwebs veiled the corners, but at the far end, resting on a ledge no higher than his chest, was a bundle wrapped in linen, stained and old. He unwrapped it carefully. Inside, a small wooden bowl, smooth with age and a comb not new, not carved for him. The wood was darkened with time, the teeth slightly worn, but the curve of it, the feel in his hand, felt right, like it had waited. He held it quietly for a long time. The rain tapped gently on the stone outside. Then, before leaving, he placed the bowl back on the ledge, but the comb he tucked into his tunic and whispered, "Thank you." He did not know why, he only knew it was deserved. That night he dreamed again. The hallway with the silent books. This time one of them opened as he passed. Inside, a drawing of the bowl, and beneath it, a name he could not read, but which made his chest feel warm. He awoke smiling. The comb rested under his pillow, and for the first time he felt the abbey was not only shelter, it was listening back. There were no lessons, not in the usual sense. No one took Emmerich aside to teach him the history of St. Ethelred's Abbey. No scrolls were unrolled before him, no speeches delivered in echoing halls. And yet he learned. The Abbey taught him. Not through words, through rhythm. Each morning he awoke moments before the bell that never rang. He washed his hands in silence, walked the corridor to the cloister before anyone else had stirred. The stones there, damp with dew, greeted him like old friends. He would pause by the fountain, whisper a wordless hello, then begin his day. He knew which broom to choose from the supply room, though none were marked. He knew which bench squeaked, slightly less when sat upon with care. He knew which candle in the chapel always flickered when prayers were answered. No one had shown him these things. He simply felt them. The abbey guided his hands. One morning, as the wind swept early leaves across the outer garden path, Emmerich wandered toward the northern wing, a place used rarely, where old tools and cracked barrels rested beneath broken windows. The air was different there, not darker, deeper. He stepped quietly, breathing with the walls, as he always did. Behind an old linen shroud, he found a small door, not hidden, simply waiting. Inside, a tiny chamber with dust dancing in the light like falling ash. On the floor, half buried in straw and time, was a flat stone. Its surface was smooth, but near the center a spiral had been carved, faint, shallow, as if the carver hadn't needed it to last, only to exist. His heart beat once, twice, then slowed. He knelt, ran his fingers over the spiral. It was the same shape he had traced in his dream book, the same as the faded tapestry near the bell tower, the same that sometimes appeared in frost on the library window. He did not try to understand it. He only remembered it. In the back of his tunic, he kept a piece of charcoal, saved from a hearth ember not yet crumbled. He drew the spiral again on his palm, then the floor. Then, softly, in the dust on the door before he closed it. As he walked back toward the main hall, he heard a faint rustle behind him, not of movement but of acknowledgement. The abbey had seen him and had nodded. That evening, during prayers, he hummed a single note beneath his breath. Not loud, but perfectly in tune with the final chord of the chant. Brother. Elias glanced over, surprised, not at the sound, at its timing, its precision. He said nothing, but his eyes lingered on the boy a little longer. That night, Emmerich dreamt of the cloister pool. The water shimmered, as it always had in his dreams, but this time he stepped into it. The ripples did not distort his reflection. They welcomed it, as if he had always belonged. He awoke just before dawn, and knew, without doubt, that he should light the library's eastern lamp before anyone entered, so he did. And as Brother Thomas arrived moments later, the light caught his tired eyes, and he smiled for no reason he could name. The abbey was not teaching Emmerich. It was remembering with him. Together, they moved toward something neither needed to name. The sun rose gently that morning. It did not announce itself with brilliance. It slipped through the clouds like a whisper. The birds did not sing loudly, but they sang right, soft, measured, as if in step with something older than dawn. Emmerich stood in the cloister garden, his hands behind his back, watching the light settle on the stones. He had grown taller in recent months. Not much, just enough that he no longer looked new to the abbey. He belonged. He did not know why, but this morning felt different, not urgent, inviting, as though the abbey had opened a door within itself, not one of wood or stone, but of meaning. He followed the path without question, through the eastern corridor, past the refectory, around the scriptorium. Every turn felt guided, not by hand but by memory. He reached the quietest part of the abbey, the oldest hall, rarely walked, where the stone beneath the floor was thick with forgotten footsteps. There was a small wooden door at the end. Had never opened it, not because it was forbidden, because it had never called to him before. Now it did. He placed his palm upon it. It gave way like breath. Inside, a chamber, round and empty, but not cold. At its center, a low stone pedestal. Upon it, a book, bound in soft leather, worn by age, no title, no clasp, only a small spiral drawn faintly on the cover. He opened it, blank pages, but as he turned them, a warmth rose. In his chest, he did not read, he remembered. Each page was a breath, a moment, a kindness past, a silence held, a gaze shared. and as he reached the final page, he saw a name written not in ink, but in thought. Anselm. He did not startle. He did not wonder. He knew. The spiral was not a sign. It was a breath drawn inward. Not to close, to continue. He closed the book, sat beside the pedestal. The room held its silence. Not empty, full. He placed his hands on his knees, closed his eyes, listened. The abbey breathed with him, a slow, steady rhythm, stone-light memory, and he felt it, the bell, not ringing, recognizing, and in that breath, that stillness. He smiled, not with lips, with presence. Outside, the monks prepared breakfast. The sky turned from gray to pale gold. A breeze moved through the arches carrying nothing but peace, and within the deepest part of the abbey the spiral turned, not ending, not beginning, just continuing.